Hello and welcome to the LLG vlog. I'm Helen McGrath, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and I'm joined this week by Dennis Hall, our Bulletin Editor. Hello, Dennis.
Hello, Helen.
So, what's our topic this week, Dennis?
Well, the forthcoming elections are on everyone's minds. But here's the question. How will the new rules work in a general election? And there's been a legal challenge to the government concerning those new voter ID rules. The campaign organisation, the Good Law Project, has sent a letter before action to the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Michael Gove, regarding his response to a report by the Electoral Commission on the impact of those voter ID requirements. Acting on behalf of a registered voter and trans woman with disabilities who has no photographic identification, the Good Law Project claims the government's new voter ID rules are blocking the registered voter from exercising her democratic rights. Helen, now I remember we covered the issue of voter ID a few times last year, and I thought that there was a feeling that this change didn't turn out to be as bad as first thought. The Association of Electoral Administrators, and I'm sure we'll come on to their views, is more concerned, as I understand it, about getting staff to do polling station work in the first place, and that stopping people voting was putting people off from applying. Helen.
Well, I think that's probably right. If you look at the issues facing the sector at the moment in terms of the prevalence of abuse against councillors and officers, surely it must be in the minds of people who are volunteering their time to, I know there's a small remuneration for it, but essentially, it's quite a tough gig going along and running a polling station. And if you're going to have to stop people from voting because they don't have voter ID, that's necessarily causing a conflict, isn't it? So I can understand, although to be fair, there were the local elections where this was, I say piloted, it came into force. There were no reported sort of major incidents at all. But of course, we were talking about quite a low turnout, let's just say 35%. It's normally around that for local elections. If we move to a general election and we see 60, 65, 70% turnout, then obviously the statistical probability is going to raise, isn't it, Dennis? So
indeed. Of course, the problems that the Good Law Project case has raised is that the point that the Electoral Commission report made was that the adverse impact upon voting was likely to be greater at a general election. So the new rules will be tested for the first time sometime this year.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And the Electoral Commission, it's said quite a lot about voter ID, and it's published a report following the May 2023 elections. Can't believe that's sort of almost a year ago now, where they highlighted evidence that some people found it harder than others to show accepted voter ID. And this includes disabled people, and the unemployed. And the report said that rules were likely to have a large impact, obviously, as you said, at the general election, and recommended that the government makes changes at the earliest opportunity. The report confirmed the interim findings that most people who wanted to vote, were in fact able to do so, and certainly that's what we're aware of. But as we've said, there were two sort of overlapping issues, really. There were variances in levels of ownership of accepted ID and also in the awareness of the new requirement. And the Electoral Commission did recommend changes to the UK government to improve accessibility and support people who do not have accepted ID. But what could happen in relation to a general election is that there could be this mass sort of move last minute for voter certification in relation to an acceptable form of ID. So, the voter authority certificate applications could really cause a bit of a pinch point in terms of the resources on local government. But tell us more about the Good Law Project, Dennis, in terms of their claim against government.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had the report, We've had the recommendations, and we've had the government's response. And the government response has been not to accept the recommendations from the Electoral Commission. And it's this that the Good Law Project have latched upon. And the challenge that they've made basically involves three grounds of challenge. The first one is on the grounds of breach of public sector equality duty. And it highlights the point that the government has decided not to expand the list of permissible forms of ID. And the Good Law Project say this: there is considerable evidence that the existing requirements have and will have a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities, ethnic minorities, younger people, and people sharing the protected characteristics of gender. So that's their key central point on that. And then they move secondly on to an allegation that there's been a breach of Section 6 of the Human Rights Act 1998 when taken with Article 14 of the ECHR and Article 3, Paragraph 1 of that. In a nutshell, they say the decision of the government not to accept the recommendations falls within those provisions because the voter ID requirements are applicable to general elections and are liable to affect the exercise of the right to vote in that context. And third and finally, the ground has been put forward that there's been a breach of what's termed the Thameside duty of inquiry. And perhaps I can explain that for those of our members who may have forgotten about it, including me. The Thameside duty of inquiry requires decision makers to seek out information reasonably required to make an informed decision. Now, the Good Law Project simply make this point, that the response from government demonstrates that, frankly, the Secretary of State simply didn't make any inquiries, didn't seek out information, and therefore is in breach of that duty referred to there. So it's an interesting claim, this, and it's quite timely given the fact that we've got elections ahead of us. So there'll be a lot of people listening and waiting to see what happens to this. Now, here's to add, I'm not aware of any date for the hearing of this case.
No, I was just going to ask that question, Dennis.
Yeah.
No, but well, obviously that's really interesting, and all eyes will be on that. Absolutely. I think there are some other issues expected at the forthcoming elections, actually. And if anyone's got a copy of the MJ, Peter Stanion, who's the chief executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators, has set out a really helpful article, actually, where he kind of runs through a litany of what people should be looking out for. Incidentally, it's on the second page of an article I've written about the digital imprint regime, which I would recommend that people look at, because that does have consequences in relation to council resources and other matters, actually. But one of the things he highlights, and I find it really interesting, and people might have kind of missed it, and I'm just going to have a quick look at the article here, is that online registration systems for overseas voters are absolutely crucial, he says, and that because the 15-year limit on UK PGE voting rights for British citizens living overseas was removed last month. So that's a potential tripling of eligible voters from 1.1 million to 3.5 million. And to register, he says, overseas applicants can cite a previously registered address or address they last lived at if they never registered. But unfortunately, without documentary proof, and that's going to be difficult for someone who left the UK quite a long time ago, obviously. There's this very time-consuming attestation process which is required. Now, it doesn't go into details about that, but whether or not someone would be motivated to move ahead in order to vote in relation to that, it remains to be. He reminds us that there shouldn't be any blame. This isn't a blame game when people are trying to do their best in serving the democratic process. And participating in elections and electoral delivery. But he does remind us as well that, the new requirements and all this litany of changes have been, and I'll quote him, bolted onto a system that needs a top-to-toe rewrite for the 21st century. But we could say the same about local government law in general, couldn't we, Dennis?
Indeed. I mean, the burden of change, I've heard Peter Stanion speak at an LLG conference relatively recently, and he makes the point that they're concerned, his members are concerned about the totality, it's the cumulative impact of all of the changes that are burdening electoral administrators at any one time. It isn't any one thing, it's the collection and the collective effect of all of this. And he makes this powerful case for sort of incremental change immediately, or have a big change much later on, but have it considered and thought through. But don't hit the members with so much material, so much change, so heavily in one stride like this, as has happened in recent months, indeed recent years, with all the changes that have come in. There needs to be a planned approach. That's what I'm trying to say here. And he feels that there isn't a planned approach to change in the electoral sector, whilst recognising, as you say, there is a need for change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, interesting discussion, Dennis. I suppose, we won't have to wait that long, will we, to find out?
No, we'll see what happens. We'll see in practice what happens.
Absolutely.
But we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, really interesting discussion. For our listeners, please do read the bulletin and listen to the Grapevine podcast for more local government news and case law. And on that note, it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye.